I'll never forget the day I read a book. It was contagious, 70 pages. There were pictures here and there, so it wasn't hard to bear. The day I read a book.
Well, let's go ahead and get started anyway. We're recording and we'll see. I mean, sometimes you get a crowd, sometimes you don't. But you guys showed up, so you deserve the time to have a discussion. I have to say that I did not have high hopes for Endless Summer based on the jacket blurb, a passionate love story about a Danish woman and a much younger Portuguese artist. The Endless Summer confronts ideas of time, sexuality, and tragedy in a style reminiscent of both Proust and Lars von Trier, or like Elena Ferrante meets Virginia Woolf's The Waves, which is like, I mean, to me, this is like classic, let's just grab names and throw them there and, see what sticks, kind of like pasta to the wall. And at least for me, it wasn't like that at all. In fact, which was refreshing for sure, because I mean, as I joked to somebody on Twitter, I almost feared like it was going to be Seinfeld's bad European movie, Rochelle, Rochelle, if you remember. It almost seemed like it was going down that path before I started, and it isn't like that at all, really. What fabulous sentences, for one thing. And I would love to know how much of this is the translator and how much of this was, Madame Nielsen themselves in Danish, because for an English language writer to write that way is on its own pretty amazing, and to have it come through a translator, it's remarkable. Before we start into that and discussion, in hopes that we get our other host showing up here, he didn't say he was going to have an issue today. I did want to mention a few things. I always like to hear what else folks are reading. I mean, I'm quite open. I'm taking absolute advantage of this year to just stick to short books, which I have found I'm much more willing to sit down and read for an hour and say, well, I'll get halfway through, versus saying, oh, wow, I'll only get 50 pages into a 300-page book, and I feel like I'm not making any headway. And I've also used it to read stuff that isn't neglected, because of my other website, I tend to read stuff that's been out of print for a while. I will say that the best stuff I read this month was so good, and I was so blown away with it, that I have reached out to try to obtain the rights so we can reprint at least one of. It was a English writer, did 3 books back in the 70s, 80s. And they are something. And so I've actually reached out, and I'm hoping, and I'm afraid to mention the name right now, because I have a feeling they're working through an agency. The estate works through an agent, literary agent. And my suspicion is, as soon as they know that somebody's interested, they're now shopping the book to a richer publisher in hopes that they'll pick it up. So I'm not, not that I suspect any of you, but, I've become paranoid dealing with literary agents, from my experience, not as a writer, but as somebody being a publisher, is, not been a productive path overall. If I'd gone through agents, I don't think half the people who've written introductions for us for the Recovered Book series would have agreed to do it. They would have been hoisted off. But the ones I can talk about, I posted about this and a number of other from the Seagull books series of German literature So this is a series of about 49, actually it's 51 unpublished, hitherto unpublished poem by Durs Grunbein about Dresden, both the bombing, the life before the bombing, and then the recovery of the city, and also the legacy, because apparently there's a bit of a controversy in Germany that there are some who feel like it's looked at too, that essentially, well, Dresden's not the only one that got firebombed, so why do they get all the attention? Which is a strange, Holocaust or war destruction jealousy is quite a strange emotion, but terrific book, very accessible poems. And one of the things I like about this edition is there are really excellent notes in the back, including some photos, not that I'm finding any of them, to help understand what the scenes involved in the book are, or the poem. The next one just actually finished 2 days ago, is this one by Eric Vuillard. It's a translation of a French book, which actually won the Prix Goncourt. It's called The Order of the Day, which is, have any of you read Benjamin Labatut's, oh gosh, now I'm blanking out on the title of it. But it was a book that came out about 2 years ago. It was hugely raved, at least the translation came out a couple of years ago. And it was about Heidegger and a number of, not Heidegger, but von Heisenberg and a number of scientists and mathematicians. And people raved about it like, oh, this is so different and new. But that's exactly what this guy is doing, which is he's taking a novelist's imaginative view of a period of a series of kind of historical snapshots. So this is all kind of in the context of the German annexation of Austria in 1938. And a series starts with a meeting between Hitler and Goering and prominent German industrialists like the heads of Siemens and Krupp, and then essentially how the machinations by which Austria was annexed. And it's very, to me, it's very like Stefan Zweig wrote a number of historical portraits, biographies, and also kind of historical scene sketches where he employed a very novelistic approach to it. He was very willing to kind of make stuff up, or at least imagine it might have been like this. And it just strikes me, one of the things that bugged me about Benjamin Labatut's, the reception of that book, was that, it's not new. This is something that's been going on for a long time. And there's an example, a nice example of how to apply a novelistic approach to history.
I think the book you're thinking of is called When We Cease to Understand the World. Is that the one yeah.
It's the one, When We Cease to Understand the World, which I didn't think it was a bad word, but I just thought it was blown out of proportion as like something very experimental and wild, when like, no, that isn't. I mean, a lot of people publish straight, and a very good example that I've kind of been a project I wanted to do was a writer named Thomas Beer, who was a hugely successful magazine short story writer in the 20s and 30s. And he wrote a biography of Stephen Crane in which he made up numerous episodes and facts. He just made them up. And has suffered in terms of his reputation thereafter. But, his attitude was like, it made logic for the story as I wanted to tell it. So I'm doing it.
Well, that's very fitting for Crane, too. The man who's best known for writing about a war he wasn't in. So
that's absolutely right. I think it's also interesting for that kind of interests me, because we have Paul Auster's huge biography of Crane that came out within the last year or two. And Beers is really, it's slightly over Wafer-Thin, but it's quite succinct. The next one I've tweeted about, this one I don't know how I found out about this one, but what an interesting book, The Ghost of the Executed Engineer, which is about a man named Peter Palczynski, who was a mechanical and mining engineer, a civil engineer sort of guy, who was totally in favor. I mean, his heart was behind the Bolshevik movement, the revolution, but he quickly ran into the fact that the Communist Party, even by the early 20s, was far more interested in pushing the party line than scientific facts and engineering realities. And so by I think 28, he was arrested. It was like the first purge of Stalin's time. And he and a number of other engineers were accused of committing sabotage and tried and, shot in the Lubyanka and elsewhere. But a fascinating story because Graham is actually somebody who's been studying Soviet engineering all of his professional life. And he has some great stories that he interweaves with that. And the last one, again, I don't remember how I came across this one, but it's called This Very Sun. It's quite obscure. It's by a woman named Edith Heel. And it's such a strange book. It's basically this photographer goes to Tucson to take some cheesecake shots. This is 44. So he's been in and out of war zones for 5, 6, 7 years. And he's totally a burnt out case. And he's put in the hands of a kind of a broken down novelist to help set up all the arrangements in the town. Well, the novelist just kind of knows the drunks and the prostitutes and the criminal, low life criminals. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sitting around and talking and drinking, and they don't actually end up taking the pictures, or they take the pictures, but there's no film in the camera, which is a spoiler alert, I guess. But I mean, and this is from Crown Publishers, which was a pretty reputable major US publisher. And this is just like, this is so absurd and unexpected. So I wouldn't know. I'm not sure if I think it's a really good book, but it's a very experimental book in its way, I guess. So let's hear what you guys have been up to. Anything? I see a couple in the chats. So Audrey, yeah, somebody. Well, I guess it was. I'm trying to think who was pushing Love and Death on Long Island. Wasn't it in January that somebody was pushing it? It's a wonder. Actually, Gilbert Adair has a number of ones, and one of them I don't have my fingertips. I just picked up. He has a very short, like 100-page biography of the Polish young man who was the real life model of Tadzio in Mann's Death in Venice. And another one that I posted about, which has been reissued by Valancourt, which is about, a Faust kind of, possessed writer making a deal with the devil. And it's a nice twist on the Fausting story. I can't remember the title of it. I think it's The Death of the Author, actually. So Adair, I would certainly recommend. I think most of his stuff, if it's not wafer thin, it's 10, 20 pages over. So have you seen
Spring Garden was interesting. I tweeted about it. It sort of focuses on this kind of drifting through space guy, which is, there's some similarities to the style of this book a little bit. He'd been a hairdresser, and then his cousin got him a job in the big city, and he moves to this apartment block, but it's a short-term thing because they're going to tear it down. And there's sort of a melancholy about change, and yet some things were like, these apartments were not well made, so probably they should be torn down. Life is full of change. But then there's a woman that's also in the apartment, is obsessed with this azure blue house, and there was a book made of it, and it just becomes a thing. And just him sort of living alongside her passion, it sort of wakes him up a little bit. And by the end, I think he's a little bit of a happier person. He can take a walk somewhere. He can make plans for the future. I don't think it's necessarily meant to do that, but that's the result of it. I just thought it was quite good. So I would highly recommend that.
And is that a relatively recent one, or?
I want to say it's 10 years old, something like that. And it's one of those where I'm pretty sure it was a capsule review, New York Times book review, and I just put it on my TBR, forgot about it, and then I decided one way to try to get to my TBR is just to buy this stuff that's not in my library system, and then I took 3 of them on vacation and managed to get to them. So
Yeah. Well, I've been taking advantage. One of the wonderful things about Montana has pros and cons. But one of the big pros, in my opinion, is if you have a state driver's license, you have borrowing rights at any state university, which is a huge thing because we have a nice city library here in terms of what it does for the community, but their collection, is everything by Danielle Steele in 3 copies. And I've been pulling some books like that to help cut down on how many are purchases. And that there are so many good short books. I was in the library actually yesterday, just going through the stacks and taking down titles and taking some home. So a couple others. Borgia says the details by, is it Ia Genberg? Would you be willing to tell us something about that, or?
Well, I really don't know how to pronounce her name. It's so I figured it's probably Ya or Ia or something like that. But I was reading it because it's been longlisted for the International Booker Prize. I'm trying to read the books on the long list, and it was really, really good. And just a story about a woman and the relationships that she's had in her life with these 4 people that she chooses to talk about. And it's just very interesting how she goes into, how these people affected her and what they were like. And it makes a portrait of her, eventually as you go through, but it's not in a big, revelatory way. You just get, oh, now I see how that all fit together kind of thing. And also another thing I appreciated about it was very much a Gen X book, I believe, because, she was born right around the same time I was, and a lot of the references in the book were very familiar, the whole scene in college and the people who were, punks because they were rebelling against their rich parents, and the whole idea of, the year 2000 as a big, huge thing, and everybody had to do something amazing for New Year's Eve 1999, so that stuff, it really resonated, and I thought it was really, really well done. It's a quiet.
So he's an American writer, a current contemporary writer.
A Swedish
I guess that makes sense if it's an international. Excuse me. Never mind.
So, but yeah, it was just, it was a very quiet book that just added up to so much, by the end. I just really appreciated that.
And Julia, you're recommending, I've seen a number of people recommend Helen DeWitt's. It's from it's New Directions, right? New Directions series of fairly large, hardbound, but quite short books that they started bringing out, I guess, in 22, I think. So tell us about it. You want to tell us a little bit about?
Well, it's I said in the chat that if Nabokov could write concisely, he would have written like DeWitt, which is kind of a joke, and of course he could, Pal Fire. But
I can see the ghost of Labacas coming to your house tonight.
Oh, that's fun. But it's a wonderful book in that it's a huge story that she only gives us a piece of. And it's beautifully, beautifully written. It's very funny. It's very sharp. It's very evocative. It's about an heiress, kind of, And if it's sort of, maybe it's about the rootlessness of the cosmopolitan person who's brought up in different countries, but it's
Right.
about a lot of other things too. But that's sort of where the intersection with Nabokov really comes. Yeah.
Well,
It's
that's
a
fascinating
beautiful
because
book, and it's like
DeWitt,
130 pages long.
wow, DeWitt is American, but she's been living in England for
Yeah,
many years, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
I mean, now you make me even more interested in reading it because I worked for about 20 years for NATO, and yeah, it's just such a different where everybody. I had actually a colleague I worked with who was Danish, married to a Greek. In fact, he'd lived and he met her in Greece when he was at a NATO job in Athens, and then they lived in Italy, raised their kids in Italy. And then he spent the last 10 years of his career in Brussels. And I remember asking him, I said, what do your kids think of as home? And, you
Yeah.
know, they carry Danish and Greek passports. And, one of them went to the Sorbonne and one went to the university in Madrid, and one was a banker in Zurich. I mean, that sort of environment where you have the capacity to kind of float across borders. It's a different sensibility. It's not one that I think the majority of inhabitants on the planet are accustomed, because we do tend to root more than at least it seems to be on average that it happens. So and is it a story set on the past or relatively recent?
Recent. I don't know if
Yeah,
it's set right now, but certainly in the last 30 years.
right. Anyone else want to offer up something that you'd like to share in terms of a book you've read this month? If not, let's get into The Endless Summer. Any first reactions to it? What were your expectations and what did you find after you had a chance to read it?
I expected something that was much more plot driven
Yeah,
than it was based on the jacket copy. And so it took me like a few pages to kind of find the rhythm of the prose. But once I did, I was totally enchanted.
yeah. I think my reaction is quite similar because I thought, oh, okay, okay, now we have the scene where all the characters get introduced, but he goes down, or she or they go down. There's wonderful detours for a short book. There are such wonderful detours in this book, and that's not easy to do, I think, for a writer to do it and not find that you've devoted a chapter and a half to it.
A storygraph person said that they found this lovely, and all the meandering and detours, if you will, things where you see this person and they're described as the handsome one or the young slender boy who was maybe a girl, but isn't always said that way. Just about 10% of the time or less is said that
Mhm.
way. But if it had been at novel length, it would have been
Yeah,
too much. So it was perfect
absolutely.
at this kind of length, and you sort of dipping in and out of these people's lives. It's not so much woven together as that it just one thing, leads to another. The Portuguese man who I was sure was going to leave the lady for a long time and didn't really, and eventually
Yeah,
went back to Portugal, and they had their long distance. But if you read the thing on the back, it's all would be the love story between him and her, and they're just one strand of this loosely connected family and friends at this. And I was sure that the stepfather was going to kill half of the people. He just was very
yeah.
scary.
And it's I mean, I don't think anyone would have guessed even at least halfway through the book that it would end on the arc that it does of, Lars contracting AIDS and his death and the funeral and the sense of separation between the family and the village that knew him and the people who knew him just in that little endless summer period. That was, yeah. I mean, you kind of had a sense when he's in California and it's describing, a sentence here, a sentence there. It's really not a lot of details, but, anybody who is our age knows, that was risky behavior that unfortunately had tragic consequences for many, many people, particularly men.
Well,
So,
Madame, I don't know what pronouns Madame uses, so I'm just going to say Madame. Madame says there's a place like about 30-ish pages in where it says Lars's brother would say, or Lars's cousin would say that this was a judgment. I was like, oh shit.
Yeah.
I see where this is going because Madame keeps talking about his beautiful hands and feet, and I'm like, oh, and then they said his death was a judgment. I was like, I know. And then so when the daughter and he go to California, I'm like, no, Lars, no, because I lost so many friends to AIDS. That was like, I can, see that coming like a truck, but it was so beautifully and subtly foreshadowed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like, in fact, I'm so glad you brought up that point of the remark of the brother, because one of the things I liked about this, having lived in Europe, is that there are moments when you kind of think, well, everybody's sophisticated and cosmopolitan, and they go for vacations in Tunisia or Crete or wherever, and then suddenly you get reminded, this is a Lutheran country with black and white moral judgments as kind of the backstop. And in fact, I know a Danish woman, who, gosh, another example, Danish woman married to an Italian man. They both work for the EU. They work for the EU in Beijing and Kuala Lumpur. And now they're debating where they're going to retire. And the only thing I know she said is, we're never going to retire in Denmark. And I asked her why, and she says, the church is still there. And so that's a sort of, I mean, that to me, that was another such a wonderful, rich aspect of this is it's there. He brings it in, he sticks it in like a knife, and then we move on. It's not dwelling. It's not, it's not making it a profound thing that's going to be hashed over. The brother says it, you suddenly get caught short by that kind of severe judgment and rejection. And then, and the contrast between that, the acceptance, the family sense of at the funeral and the memorial service, I guess, and afterwards, that you have this one sort of ad hoc community, the endless summer community that just sort of bonded in this house. And then the real community that's been there all along, which has a very different perspective on kind of like everything.
And there's the other artist who sort of in his 40s kind of gets converted to some very fundamental Christian, the artist with the receding hairline who meets the man on the park bench who tells him all about Jesus, and then like his whole life kind of, so it's so interesting to like, oh, you could be part of this artistic community, very sophisticated, very international, but there's always this kind of older tradition, ready to kind of scoop some people up in it.
Yeah, well, that's another example, I think, of the fact that Nielsen creates these kind of threads, and like people in real life, some people go off in a place you think that, I mean, doesn't make any sense, but that's where they've gone, My wife has a close friend. She just lives up in a cabin in the mountains. She's gone off the grid, quite paranoid, classic Northern Idaho type. And I can remember meeting her for the first time 40 years ago and thinking, wow, what a cool with it, tied in person. Well, who knew? Who could have predicted it? But those are the trajectories that life takes us on. And this book, it really, I have to say that I think this is probably my favorite book so far this year, just in terms of being impressed with what the writer accomplishes, and how well it's done. I mean, it really, if you devote yourself to the close, slow reading, and that's the first thing I noticed, is that within 2 pages, I was slowing down and taking my time with the rhythm of the sentences, and seeing where they go. And it's just fascinating. So I have to, it's unfortunate that James is here is not here to be taking the credit for this, because I trust his judgment in many things, but this one was just a gimme for that when we were dividing up the year, I figured there were some I would just take on faith, and this was one of them. And I think it was a good choice.
Yeah, I was very impressed with the translation. I thought,
Yeah,
I mean, obviously I haven't read the original. I don't read Danish, but I really think that, the idea of the book and the rhythm of it, the way that it was all worked together, just really came across in the translation so well. And there were several sections where I wondered, about how the original Danish, there was one point where they referred to the word initiation, only they called it initiation. And, in the sense of like consuming something kind of thing. And I was like, boy, I would really like to know what the original Danish was there, because, that just seems like such an interesting kind of clever way of looking at that word.
yeah.
And I would love to see, where that came from and how they got there. Just
Yeah,
really
was
for
it the source or was it the translator?
What's that?
Was it the source or was it the translator? Was it the
Yeah.
author or was it the translator that came up with those things?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm convinced that no one knows a book better than a translator, and I include the author in that. And I think that's because, a writer may do things because it seems kind of gut right without knowing the logic behind it, but a translator's got to figure it out it's like putting a car back together, but with different parts. I have the same design, but I have to have different parts, but it's got to end up as pretty much the same car. That's that kind
Yeah,
of relationship with the text is intense.
especially with a text like this where it's so, really singular, the voice, it's really, not what you expect in a lot of ways. And I think,
Absolutely.
being able to translate that and get that across in a language that isn't the language the writer used is just really impressive.
Yes, it is. I would love to hear an audio book version of this. I think it would be the sort of thing where you just could kind of close your eyes and just let the voice carry you away, because it is kind of like that. In some ways, there are some books which are actually better to listen to than read, I have to say, because you get the sound of the voice, you get the rhythm of the prose, all those sorts of things that we kind of have to do with the voice. At least I would never make a speed reader, because I still in effect sound out the voices, sound out the words as I'm reading along. I don't know how to scan fast, so I'm always been a slow reader from that standpoint.
Yeah, I think the audio book, as far as the jumps in time, the way that in the middle of they would leap back and forth between, talking about the past, talking about the future, talking about what was happening then, and the way the author kept going back to, okay, and now the endless summer is starting, this is the beginning of it all, that kind of thing. it was so conversational, I think, and I think the audiobook would really bring that out, that idea of, I'm telling you this story and I'm digressing here and I'm getting ahead of myself, and now we're jumping back. Oh, and now the story is really beginning. It was like a person really telling a story that long, it would do.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I hadn't thought about it, but you're right that, it's not necessarily following. It'd be interesting to see this actually sort of diagrammed out from a structural standpoint, because I'm always fascinated by, if somebody doesn't do the straightforward chronological beginning, middle, end, or the novels that say take four characters and follow them switching back and forth. You can see structurally how somebody could diagram that out. This would be fascinating to see sort of represented like actually somebody on Twitter shared the image of they bothered to diagram one of the sentences in this book, and it's like 5 pages long with lots of trees and things like that. And yet done remarkably, there are a few cases where you can see the sentence goes on so long that Madame Nielsen has to like remind us who the subject of the sentence is by repeating it. But, as a reader, you're kind of thankful for that kindness and not saying, I told you who the subject was 4 pages back. Yeah, stick with it.
I
That to
found it kind
me,
of remarkable for so few people who were given names: Christina, Stina, Maz the stepfather, and then like the one person from wherever, Lars, and nobody else. I was able most of the time, every once in a while, I'll be like young man. I'm like, okay, is this a slender young man? Is this the young man who probably is a girl? Is it Lars? Is it, is it one of the two
Right.
Portuguese guys? And then the younger brothers. But it was remarkable because it was so consistent, the descriptions of the descriptors of who they were, that every once in a while, and towards the end was the artist. I'm like, wait a minute, because I had forgotten the artist. The artist had disappeared for a while. All of a sudden
Right.
was back in their 40s and interacting with someone else. And I'm like, wait, whose mother died? But that was maybe 5 times in the whole book that I got slightly confused. So I thought that was excellent also.
Yeah. Julia, you were going to say?
oh, I was going to say, I actually think that is where the comparison to Elena Ferrante is really apropos, in that it jumps around through past and present and foreshadows the way she does. That, and then 30 years later, she would think back on it and do, we knew at that time, we didn't know that one day he would. And so I see that connection. And I also see the connection of it being kind of like, this story is a story about, to me, this story is a story about the last 30 years of the 20th century in so many ways. The sort of rise of international travel, cheap international travel for students, the daughter's father being part of the Christiana commune in its early days, just a lot of like the ferment happening, and then to end with sort of AIDS and the backlash from the religious community and the development of a trans life however Madame would describe their life. So like it's such a microcosm of so many big movements. So I think, well, why didn't they market it like that? Like this is a beautiful elegy for the 20th century and artistic life in the 20th century. Instead of saying it's about a passionate love affair, because it is, but that's really not what it's about. I mean, that happens, but it's not what it's about.
Yeah, exactly. It happens, but it's not what the book is about. In fact, to me, the book is about, and the reason I ended up thinking so much about it was such a great series of meditations on just life, lives, plural, that it's not following one character through a trajectory. It's got all of these, and yeah, the doubling back and saying, okay, in future, this is going to happen. We're all, examples of how it is kind of like somebody telling you a story about a group of people that they knew. And, that's, that's a story that there is no one right model for how to tell that story. It's not necessarily, you see group biographies that follow one character and then somebody they knew and it follows them again. And, that's one way to do it, but there is no one. Chronology is not the right answer, because in fact, chronology often undermines the narrative, if you will, that happening in time sequence loses the story, because our chronological lives have lots of dead, uninteresting periods in them. So you don't actually want anybody to write about that. Maybe a couple of sentences so you get the flavor of boredom, but not, you can't reproduce that in terms of chronology, at least. And I think, again, I was not expecting this at all, especially seeing a photograph of Madame Nielsen, knowing his or her many transformations along the way. This is definitely a book that I would recommend to other people, but certainly I fault the publisher for propelled by a captivating story. Well, this is not a captivating story. I'm sorry. In fact, I'm editing an essay for somebody right now, and they used the word captivating. I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, they end up in a death camp. That's not captivating. It may be fascinating, it may be compelling. Those are words that are sort of negative, but captivating, you think, somebody's riding bicycles through a forest at some point or something like that. So you can't always tell a book by its cover, can you? As Bo Diddley once said. So next month we have this one, which is close to the shortest one we've got on the list. Aleksandra Lun's The Palimpsests. I haven't read it myself. This was another of James's choices. And it definitely looks like it's in the spirit of a lot of Eastern European literature, which means it's absurdist and comic and other things. So hopefully folks are getting a hold of this one. This is only neglecting the translator's notes. It's 95 pages long, so it's not heavy lifting for sure. But I'm looking forward to that. Plus, I have a nice stack of stuff that I got from the library yesterday, including some more Seagull books. So I'm going to stick with a German jag for a while. Any other comments that folks want to offer? I apologize for this being a little bit lean, but my attitude is those who show up deserve a chance to participate. We're not going to cancel because we don't have a quorum or something like that. Well, please, if you find stuff that you're interested in, you want to plug, definitely tweet on about them if you're using Twitter. It hasn't seemed to gone completely down the toilet yet, but who knows where things go. Good things are destroyed in our world all the time, unfortunately. And so, yeah, we'll put out, I've been trying to put out little lists of stuff once a week, no more often than that. Partly because I find it so fascinating. I'm stumbling across all sorts of little goodies that I feel like sharing. So about every week you'll see something on the email list, and then we'll get together in late April and see what we think of the Palimpsests.
You were quote tweeted by Joyce Carol Oates though a couple weeks ago, so that was.
Is that right? Which one was that?
I don't even remember, but it was something that you said or lamented something, and I was like, wow, look at that. Neglected Books gets quote
Well,
tweeted
actually,
by
just this afternoon, weeks ago, I mentioned Nicholson Baker's The Mezzanine, which is one of my absolute favorite books. And just today, Nicholson Baker picked up that and said, "Oh yeah, well, you know, thanks." So,
well, if I find that Joyce Carol Oates, I'll send it your way in case you.
I mean, I've probably seen it, but yeah.
It made me laugh. So
that's my 15 seconds of fame, which is, I think, about all I'm due in this game. Okay, well, folks, thanks for joining us. Those of you did, and please, keep talking about these things. As I said, to me, I feel like I've stumbled on a little gold mine by saying, no, I'm just going to look for the short stuff and focus on that. And definitely my productivity as a reader has gone up significantly. And plus, just the opportunity to read some more current stuff has been a nice change of pace for sure. So thanks for your comments and recommendations. We will see you again in April. Happy reading, everybody.